There we go. So welcome, everybody. We've got a couple people here on Zoom. And we've got a few people, and I'm being told that the early service is still going. So so we may have some more people joining us shortly.
Somebody did a longer sermon.
Yeah. So anyway, Sandy's just brought up that she was trying to find the recordings to our fall forum on the Book of Joy and was unable to. So for anyone else who's in that same predicament, to get there, you go to Trinity's homepage and then scroll down past the announcement for this forum, keep going past Compline, and then you'll get to a spot where there's 4 little windows, and one of them is simply called Forum. Join the discussion. If you click on that, that link will take you to the page that has the recordings of, and I'm doing it myself. The recordings for our discussion of the Book of Joy, and it's also got the recordings for our discussion of Jung's undiscovered self. So all of those are still accessible, but it's on a different page than the links for this current forum. So if you missed those and want to go back, those are still available. And thanks to Trish Schertz, our web master for the church, for working with me to keep those available to folks. So thanks again, Sandy, for bringing that to my attention. And let me switch it. There we go. I'm going to babble a little bit while we wait for hopefully some 8:30 folks to wander in, because we've only got 2 or 3 people here, excuse me, at the moment. Because there hasn't been a whole lot of lead time for people to get the book, I thought we would spend, there's Mike in the background, wandering around.
You didn't stand at the exit of the church and hand out your pamphlets to come down the hall for you?
Well, actually, last Sunday I did go up front and
Announce it,
and I held up the book. There it is. And this is the 4th time I've led a discussion of this book. I've done it in 3 different churches, 2 in Arizona and 1 when I was at Rancho Cordova here. And it has generated some interesting discussion. But one of the things I wanted to do today, on the assumption that most people have not had time to get the book, unless you got it in a Kindle version and could download it immediately. But if you ordered a paper copy, it's probably still somewhere in a UPS truck or something. So I wanted to just begin with getting an assessment of where people are in terms of their basic knowledge of what he's talking about, which is what he calls the historical critical approach to the Bible.
I know.
Not at all. Okay, so there's one voice over here who says not at all. Mike?
Yeah.
You're familiar with it. Okay, so if I said to either of you, can you tell me about the 4-source hypothesis for the synoptic gospels?
That's a little fuzzy. I don't remember.
Do you remember hearing about a presumed document called Q?
Yes.
You know about Q? Okay.
It's just a source for, but they don't know where it is, but it's a
Right.
source.
Right. Okay. Here's a couple. Hi.
Here's a couple.
Hi, guys. Well, we've started our Zoom session, and
Cool.
so come on in. We're just beginning. I said that since there hasn't been a whole lot of time, I'm assuming most folks haven't gotten the paper copy. You may have tried to download an electronic copy. You got it?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
yeah, it was $1.99 on Nook, so I snagged it.
$1.99 on Nook. Did you hear that?
I don't know if it still is. They have a way of putting them on and taking them off.
Yeah,
real
once
fast.
there's a demand, they say, oh, people are interested. Let's jack the price up.
Yes, well, exactly.
Of course. Well, so what we're doing today is a general introduction to the discussion, and I've got some show and tell, some books
Nice.
to hopefully demonstrate some of the things that he's talking about. Some of these are approaching 50 years old because I bought them in 1975 when I started seminary.
But that isn't 50 years ago.
No, it's only 47. Thank you for reminding me.
Oh my gosh.
So we're going to do I'm going to do sort of an assessment of where folks are and how much of what's in this book is going to be sort of new and astounding and shocking, or been there, done this. This is nothing new. I've heard this before. Okay, which will help me sort of gauge where we might go as we move forward. So now that we've actually got some folks here and a couple on Zoom, one of the things that I already said, but we've got 8 more people in the room than when I said it before, so I'm gonna say it again. For those of you who were interested in maybe reviewing or looking at the recordings from the discussion of Book of Joy or the Undiscovered Self, they are still available on the Trinity website, but they're not on the same page as this one. So as I said, if you scroll down the page past the banner where it talks about Compline, there's 4 buttons. One of those says Forum. If you click on that one, that will take you to the recordings of both of the prior forums. So if you missed any of those, if you're interested, those are still available. They're all there. And again, thanks to Trish, because she and I worked that out to make those available ongoing. And these will too, I presume. We'll just keep adding to them. Okay, so what I wanted to sort of
You want to ask your first question again?
thank you. That's exactly what I was going to do. How many of you have already had some exposure to or familiarity with what he calls the historical critical approach to Scripture?
I don't think so.
2 out of 2, 4, 2 out of 8. And
This board.
Sandy, Rita?
I don't think so.
Sandy, yes. Rita, no. Okay. All right. So for a lot of you, you are living examples of exactly what he's talking about at the end of his introduction. No, it's not at the end of the introduction. It's the end of the first chapter. The views I set out, this is the last paragraph of his first chapter. It's on page 18. He says, the views I set out in this book are standard fare among scholars. I don't know a single Bible scholar who will learn a single thing from this book, although they will disagree with conclusions here and there. In theory, pastors should not learn much from it either, as this material is widely taught in seminaries and divinity schools. But most people in the street and in the pew have heard none of this before. That is a real shame, and it is time that something is done to correct the problem. In my experience, he's absolutely right. And I've been ordained for 43 years. Why is it still a problem? What are our adult members not being taught, and why? What's so scary?
Oh, because it might rattle our dearly held beliefs.
Yes, yes, which is kind of the whole point of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things he's going to do, and this is sort of a subtext that I want you to keep in mind, as I said again before any of you entered the room, this is the 4th time I've led a discussion on this book in the 4th church. And I've had some very interesting discussions, especially when we get to the last chapter, and that issue of how strong is your faith, what is it based on, and what, if anything, would it take to shake it? Because his was shaken. And he says so in the very first chapter. And when you get to the last chapter, you get more details of what it was and why. And so I use this book because it works on two levels. The first is that it, as I have said many times before, he's right in that part that I just read. There was absolutely nothing in this book that I wasn't taught in seminary 45 years ago. It is not new. Which begs the question, if every priest you've known has been taught the same stuff, how come you don't know it?
The question?
Well, we'll get into that. That was rhetorical, so hold on for a minute. But one of the things that he's going to talk about that is part of that historical critical method is asking the question, okay, if say Mark's version is a little different from Matthew's, is a little different from Luke's, and if we look at those differences, what can we infer about the attitude of the author and why they slant the story a little differently? Why is Luke's version different from Matthew's, for example, of the birth narrative? And if Jesus' birth was important, how come only 2 out of the 4 Gospels mention it at all? And their stories are almost totally different. Okay, so what do we infer about that? So it's a process, much as you might have learned in an English lit class. What does the author's creation tell us about the author and the author's attitude about the world? And how does the author's mental mindset shape what they create in terms of literature? I want you to apply the same principle to the guy that wrote this book. Because in the first chapter, he tells you about his background. That as a teenager, he had a born again experience. He went to the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is a very conservative institution. And for good history of the Moody Institute, oh, you can't even, oh, just as I pick it up, my screen goes blank. I'm going to try to hold this up to the camera so you can see this. This book, called Guaranteed Pure by Timothy, and I'm going to pronounce it the German way, Gloege, Gloege, is a history of the Moody Bible Institute. Talks about its founding in Chicago in the post-Civil War era, its role in the rise of fundamentalism. In fact, the term fundamentalism came from tracts published by Moody called the Fundamentals of the Faith, which were published in the early 20th century. And their skepticism of German scholarship. After all, we just fought the Great War against the Germans. So what good could anything good come out of Germany, right? And most of the historical critical method is based on either American, British, or German scholarship. So when I was in seminary, I read Bultmann, Bornkamm, and Bonhoeffer, you know, and was glad that I'd studied German in high school and college. And so there's this strain that runs through American Christianity, and we see it writ large today in our political divide, which is very much reflected similarly in a sort of evangelical conservative Christian and a mainstream Christian.
So are you
divide.
saying that the Moody's was the foundation for fundamentalism, evangelicalism?
Well, the term, as it's been popularized today, comes from documents they published defending their, what those of us in the mainline liberal churches would call a very narrow view of scripture, defending it against what they felt were attacks by exactly this kind of scholarship. Yeah, they found that sort of scholarship threatening, much as they found Darwin forgot Darwin's name.
I forgot Darwin.
Darwin and the theory of evolution as an attack on the biblical story of creation. I mean, it's the Scopes monkey trial, which is 1920s. So this is, 100 to 150 years of this increasing split between those who view the Bible as inerrant, which is where he started from.
Mm.
And then he talks about going from Moody to Wheaton College, which is an evangelical Christian college in Illinois, to Princeton Theological. Liberal Presbyterians. Oh my God.
Liberal Presbyterian.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a minute. Yes. But in terms of where American Christendom is in, and he arrived at Princeton 3 years after I arrived at the Church Divinity School in Berkeley. So we're very much contemporaries, which really rocked his world
Mhm.
because he had never been exposed to this kind of biblical criticism. And I hadn't really either, but that's just because I didn't come out of that background. I mean, I started attending the Episcopal Church when I was in high school. But yeah, to your point, the notion that the Presbyterian seminary was liberal. I mean, the Presbyterians are the Calvinists who in the 16 and 1700s in England were known as the Puritans. And they're the ones that got on the Mayflower and sailed away from England to get away from us, the Anglicans. Okay.
Because
Right.
The rest of England was too liberal.
Yeah, because we weren't conservative enough, we weren't reformed enough for their liking. So how things changed in a couple of hundred years.
Yeah.
So that now you could sort of lump, when we say mainline Protestant, what are we talking about? Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopal, and a good chunk of the Roman Catholic Church, because I read Roman scholarship about the Bible that especially Ray Brown, the Jesuit, who is a scholar of Johannine literature, unsurpassed. So again, there's nothing in this book that hasn't been around for a good 50 years,
Mhm.
which begs the question, why do most regular church-going lay people not know it?
You mean churches like ours or churches
Yeah,
like?
yeah, like ours.
Bible.
Look, no, like ours,
Like ours.
right? I mean, Christopher arrived at CDSP 3 years after me. We were taught by the same people. So I'm just saying. All right, so let me see, checking in on time. Okay. So how many of you actually have gotten the book and have been able to start to read it? One, two, okay. All right. Yeah, by electronic download, it's instantaneous. So have you gotten through the first 1 or 2 chapters? No? Okay, all right. So in, as I said, in chapter 1, he sort of begins talking about what is this historical critical method? What do we mean by it? And he talks about reading horizontally instead of vertically. That is, it's one thing to start, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John at chapter 1, verse 1, and read the whole thing to the end. And that's the way we normally do. What happens when you lay Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John side by side in parallel columns so that you can really see the nuances and the differences between those narratives? And
Yeah, because we went through a course on the 4 Gospels with Matt Warren,
okay,
and that was one of the things that he was pointing out was the fact that you have 4 Gospels ostensibly telling the same story,
mhm.
except they don't.
They were written at such
Yeah.
They were written
So-
at different times, et cetera.
This book, right, yeah, he mentions this is Kurt Onlant. I want to get to the one spot. Where is it? Oh, here it is. This is something that we all had to get. This is one of those books that I bought in 1975, and I'm holding this here. So this is the four Gospels laid side by side. This page is Greek. This page is English. With, to some extent, all that fine print at the bottom are critical notes about why they decided in terms of the Greek text which manuscripts they were going to base this on, because as he says, we don't have any originals.
Are those your underlines?
Yeah. Yeah, so when he says reading horizontally, this is the kind of stuff we had to do, whereas you read word for word, who's the same as who and who's different, and how different is it? Do they use a completely different word? Do they use the same word, but they change the tense of it? Say if it's a verb. And so this is what he's talking about. That's reading horizontally. So you compare in minute detail what changes, presumably, this author has, if we know, and we do know, or scholars accept, that Mark was the first gospel and Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark and copied extensively from Mark. Did they copy it verbatim or did they make subtle changes? And if so, what were the changes? And again, getting back to the original question, what can we infer about the authors of Matthew and Luke as to why they made the changes they made? And as you look over the whole length of the text, is there any sort of underlying theme that you can discern in the way they make those changes?
Interesting.
Why does Matthew talk about the three kings who came from someplace else, but Luke talks about the shepherds? What's the difference? Well, yes, there's a difference. And if you look at the totality of their works, you begin to be able to make some inferences as to why they make those changes that they chose to make. Okay. Based, again, this is all the fine print down here, at our best reconstruction of what the original may have been based on the manuscript evidence. And every time we dig up something else in the Middle East, we might strike it rich like we did with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which most people, you all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Okay, how many of you have heard of the Nag Hammadi Library?
Yeah.
Only two, okay. That is as if in some ways more momentous than the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Nag Hammadi Library was a vault of papyri found in Egypt after the Second World War. And it was a treasure trove of documents. And it's where, and we get to the later chapters in his book, it appears to have been a Gnostic library, that is, of books that were contemporaneous with the books in the New Testament, and which were known in the ancient world, but which were not included in our canon of scripture. And when we get to the chapter where he discusses this, we'll talk about that in more detail. But in many of those documents have been translated and published and are available. So we now have copies of the Gospel of Thomas, for example. And so we'll talk about, what are the differences, what are the theological differences in those documents, and why were they not included in the canon of scripture? And again, why do people not know about it? For some reason, the Dead Sea Scrolls got a whole lot more, notoriety in public media than the Nag Hammadi Library, but the Nag Hammadi Library theologically is probably more significant.
How do you spell that?
Nag, N-A-G, 2 words, and Hamadi, H-A-M-A-D-I.
Nog is 2 words.
Yeah, it's not Nag and Hamadi.
Which you order. Get more vowels.
Okay,
I remember my parents reading something, I believe it was written by Sholem Asch, that was talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls
mhm,
back in the 50s when I
mhm.
was
Yeah, those were discovered in,
47.
yeah, I was gonna say 47.
Something like that.
But obviously, you know, when you're talking about an artifact that's relatively delicate to begin with, and then it's 2,000 years old,
Right.
it takes a while to unroll it and then
Oh.
to photocopy it and then to translate it and then to publish it. Which begs the whole question of, you know, who produced them, the Qumran community, what was that? Who were they? They were Essenes, who were they? You know, all of these sort of questions. And this is all part of the stuff that historical critical biblical scholars are concerned with. What is the manuscript evidence? How confident are we that the Greek that is in this book, and again, if you open it to any page, this was my Greek New Testament textbook from seminary, there's all these footnotes at the bottom in which the editors of this particular version are saying, this is why we think this is our best reconstruction of the text based on the manuscript evidence.
Best guesses.
It's our best guess. But you know, they could dig up something new tomorrow and it'll change everything.
Hey, David,
David, Sandy has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Sandy. Go ahead.
when you talk about why pastors don't teach this in the church, and I thought about this because certainly I was raised in a very conservative background and had not been taught this in church. But I'm familiar with this author's writings and I've read some of those. But I think it's partly because the makeup of the churches is so diverse. So we have members who have a Baptist church background,
Mhm.
and so parts of the church really lean very conservative. And so what would happen, whether in our church or another Episcopal church, if they do start teaching this, are they going to create a lot of conflict with the more conservative people in the church? And I know when you first mentioned this book to me a few years ago, and I sampled it as a Nook book, and he of course he's first talking about his faith and how his faith changed during the course of his education and doctorate. And at the time when I was sampling it, I thought, okay, am I at a point in my life where I want to have my whole viewpoint about the Bible changed? And so I decided not to. Pardon?
How much do I want? My
Yes,
Go ahead.
but I feel like the place to do it is in a group like this, because I'm not just alone in my thoughts. I'm with other people in the church and I can get feedback and hear their thoughts. And so I feel like it's a much calmer environment for me to tackle this.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared that. Yeah, I'm hoping that in this context where we can talk about these ideas and, you know, I can help explain some of the backstory to the best of my ability. And, you know, we'll all walk through this together. I want to mention one other resource that is available commonly today. And it's sort of like the synopsis of the Gospels, but this is this thing, which compares and again lays in parallel columns the New Revised Standard, the Revised English, the New American, and the New Jerusalem Bibles.
Wow.
So you've got 4
Interpretation.
contemporary English translations of scripture, again, all laid side by side, so you can read across them and see what the editors,
Mm,
like that,
mhm.
and what are the subtle differences, and what do those differences mean, if anything? And sometimes they can be, and notice what's not in this one, but is available in other, I had one that had the, I can't even remember the names of them now. The New International Version, the Living Bible, the Amplified Bible. I mean, you walk into a bookstore and go to the section on Bibles and you've got 20 different versions. How is the common layperson supposed to know which one should I get? Okay. So hopefully after we've had this discussion, you'll be in a better position to choose this one versus this one. For example, back in the 70s, before the NRSV was produced, the standard version that was read in churches and that we used as our standard English study Bible was the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, which was considered by most scholars to be the best in terms of accuracy of translating the original, to the extent that we know what the original is. But in terms of flow of language, some people thought it was just awkward.
Yeah.
And it was before the whole inclusive language thing came into vogue. It was just starting in the late 70s when I was at Berkeley. And so the NRSV was produced to address some of those issues. So it talks about, instead of just my brothers, it's brothers and sisters. Lots of inclusive language and other, to make it flow a little bit better. But again, if you're a scholar and you know the original Greek or Hebrew, if you're interested in accuracy of translation, you're not worried about flow.
No.
But if you're using it liturgically, flow matters, right? The same is true, for example, in the English translation of the Psalms in our new prayer book. Listen to me, new, 1979. That's
the new one.
but it's newer than 1928. Yeah. One of the consultants in the process of creating the 79 prayer book was W.H. Auden, the poet. Why would we have a poet instead of a Hebrew scholar? Well, because if we're using it liturgically, we want the language to flow. It has to be accurate, but you're balancing 2 very different kinds of needs. So is there a right one or a better one? Well, it depends.
Why was J.R.R. Tolkien one of the authors of the Jerusalem Bible?
I didn't know he was. Was he involved in that work?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Stephen Colbert would love that. He probably knows too. If there's a Tolkien freak, he's in.
Know where they come from? I did.
Yeah. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to kick around while we're walking through, not just so let me, because I didn't have time to come up with an outline, but I've got it in my little notes here. So today we're basically looking at, in his book, chapters 1 and 2. Next week we'll look at chapters 3 and 4, the different variants, who the authors were, as best we know, because we don't know who Matthew was, and we don't know who Mark or Luke or John were, because they're not identified anywhere, and those names weren't applied to the books for a couple of 100 years.
Mm.
So we know nothing about the authors, except, like this guy, what we can infer about them and their mindset and their situation based on looking at the literature that they produce. Why did they make the changes to the text? Why did they include this story but not that one? For example, when we were just learning Greek, we were told if you want to start with the easy stuff, John's Greek is the simplest grammatically.
Is it Koine?
Well, it's all Koine, which means common, which was what was common in the post-Alexandrian
Right.
Eastern Mediterranean world when Greek was,
Business language.
yeah, Greek was the common language for conducting business across cultures and ethnic groups, kind of like English has become in the world today.
So Greek was the preferred language for the writings in those days?
If you were educated and if you were involved in a business that involved something beyond your little village.
So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were Hebrew or Greek that they started with? Maybe both.
They would have spoken Aramaic,
And did they write?
which, well, was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, this is the kind of stuff that we're going to talk about. So why is it written in Greek and not Aramaic?
Well, it was
Well,
the first popular published.
We're gonna
language.
blame that on Paul. But
Blame everything on Paul.
we'll get to that. And that has to do with is Christianity going to be a new sect within Judaism? Or are we going to appeal to everybody? Because if we're going to appeal to everybody, then we can't just use the language of our little sect or our little ethnic group, right? We have to use a lingua franca. We have to use a common language that more people outside of Roman Palestine speak. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, that language was Greek. So that's why the New Testament is written in Greek. Because we were, as a result of Paul and his work, the decision was made that we are going to preach the gospel not just to our fellow Jews, but to Gentiles. And they're going to be Greek speakers. So as soon as Paul leaves what you and I know as Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and travels to Athens or Thessalonica or Corinth, he's got to speak Greek. But Paul was educated in Greek. And the converse to, if you're a beginning Greek student and you want to read the New Testament, you start with John. Once you get a little more advanced and you want to get to the hard stuff, you read Luke, Acts. Because Paul's speeches, as recorded in Acts, are the most complex grammatically Greek in the New Testament. So does that mean that the author of Luke, Acts was a physician? No, there's absolutely nothing in there that's specifically medical. But was he the most sophisticately educated as reflected in his language and vocabulary? Yes. He knew his stuff. And everybody else falls somewhere in between. Okay. So it's those kinds of, I was going to say facts, they're really inferences. They're our best educated guess as to the backgrounds behind the various authors that make up this book. And so you have multiple layers of sort of inference. First, there's the manuscript evidence. How do we know what they really wrote? Well, we really don't, because we don't have an original document. In fact, and I asked this before most of you here, how many of you are familiar with the four-source hypothesis for the synoptic gospels? Synoptics means Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three that are most similar laid side by side. How many of you have heard the four-source? I'm getting blank stares. Yes? Yes.
It rings a bell.
Okay. So this is jumping ahead to next week, but we're almost out of time. So standard theory is that Mark was the first gospel written. It's shortest, simplest, and our tendency is to add on to a good story rather than take away. And I learned this when I was a senior undergrad at Flagstaff, and I was taking courses in folklore. A folk tale or a fairy tale, if you want to find the version of it that's closest to the original, you go to that ethnic group farthest away from the home country. Because once they leave the home country, the tendency to elaborate on the original story tends to stop because they're trying to preserve their culture. Whereas back at home, they keep elaborating on it. So in terms of the work in the 19th century of fairy tales and folk tales and trying to create an index of motifs, that's what people discovered. So we tend to add on to, not take away from. So what's the shortest gospel? Mark. Okay, that's going to be the first version. And from doing this kind of, let me get to my spot. This kind of cross-referencing and detailed analysis, we know that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark in front of them and plagiarized freely. However,
Copyright laws or what they
yeah, they didn't have copyright laws back then. They also did something else, because there are other large sections of Matthew and Luke that are equally word for word identical, but are not from Mark. What was that?
Q.
Well, it's called Q. Why is it called Q?
Because it's a question.
Blame the Germans,
Yes.
because the word source in German is Quelle. And because a lot of this scholarship is German scholarship, Germans being Germans, that term stuck. So the four source hypothesis is that we started with Mark and another document, and so far we haven't found it. Nobody has dug it up.
Or many Qs.
Yeah.
Could be more.
Well, hold on a minute. Don't jump ahead.
You've been reading ahead.
Yes. So we have Mark and we have Q, and we infer the existence of Q because of these passages in Matthew and Luke that are word for word the same. The assumption is they must have been copying from something else. So they being Matthew and Luke, had a copy of Mark, and they had this other document that we have never dug up yet. And that explains most of what is in Matthew and Luke. But both Matthew and Luke have other things that only they have, like Matthew's story of the three kings, or Luke's parable of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Those are only in Luke. So there are sub-Qs. There's a special source for Matthew that only Matthew had, and a special source for Luke that only Luke had. And John's way out there in left field. And we'll talk about that's a special case. And that could do how we date which one was written when. So Mark was the first, John was the last, and we'll talk about why he was the last. And then Matthew and Luke are somewhere in the middle. And then again, by looking at the subtle differences between Matthew and Luke, we can infer some things about who their intended audience were. And Luke is the only one for whom the gospel is part one and Acts is part two. And that's only Luke. Why? Why did he feel the need to write another whole book? Why wasn't just writing the gospel good enough? But again, this is all part of what we can infer about the author based on what we've got, which is only what they produced. CNN wasn't there with a microphone saying, can you tell us why you wrote it this way and not that way? We don't have that. So what we've got is as good as we're going to get until they discover another trove of 2,000-year-old papyri somewhere in the desert. And, you know, maybe sometime they will, and we'll have to revisit all this again. But until then, this is as good as we got. Did you have a,
Yeah, it was, this other analogy I've heard many times over the years about why there's so many differences in the Gospels, especially. And that's the detective analogy, that if someone is, detective team is trying to discover what really happened, they'll interview a lot of people who were eyewitnesses or close people who were eyewitnesses, and they'll get different angles, some of which seem to be contradictory, but the general consensus is, oh yeah, they can really figure out what happened. That this is, the stories are so similar that it's reliable.
yeah. Well, and he talks about that. But again, as I read his book, I keep seeing reflections of his earlier black and white. It's either right or it's wrong. It's true or it's not. Nah. Even in the 3rd century, it was common for people to look at the books that we had, and they were more than what we've got now, and say there are at least 4 levels of meaning. There's the literal, the eschatological, the moral, and the anagogical. So the notion that it means more than just what the words mean is not new. It's 2,000 years old. Let me get, this is the last paragraph of the 2nd chapter. It's on page 60. The discrepancies that involve historical narratives, what did Jesus or Paul actually say, do, and experience, make it difficult to establish what really happened in the life of Jesus or the history of the early church. You can't read these books as disinterested historical accounts. None of them is that. What would you do as a judge in a court trial in which you have conflicting testimony from eyewitnesses? One thing you would certainly not do is assume that each witness is 100% correct. Someone or everyone is getting some information wrong. The trick would be to figure out who is wrong and who is right. Are those the only 2 possibilities?
No.
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 So again, this is his own bias and his own background creeping in. So be aware of that as you're reading him. The same applies to ancient documents like those in the New Testament. If there is conflicting testimony about historical events, all the witnesses cannot be historically right. And we have to figure out ways to decide what most probably really happened. And he says we take up this task in chapter 5. One of the things that I was taught 45 years ago is that the Bible is not a history book. It was never intended to be a history book. So we err when we try to read it as if it was history. What it is theological commentary on history. That phrase was beat into my head more times than I can count. So we are reading people's own understanding of how God was working in their lives through the events they experienced. That's true whether we're talking about ancient Israel escaping slavery in Egypt, or whether we're talking about people in the 1st century who experienced this preacher from Nazareth, or Paul, or James, and the other authors of the New Testament books that we don't know who wrote them. Okay, so again, this is a whole bunch of stuff that I want you to keep in mind as you're reading through this. All right.
What's our first reading assignment?
Well, for next week, get through the first 4 chapters, because today we're focused on the first 2. Next week, we'll talk about chapters 3 and 4, which get into the New Testament books themselves, who wrote them, what are the variants, and he'll probably, and I can't remember, he'll talk about the 4-source hypothesis that I just talked about. Why is John different? which of the epistles attributed to Paul we think were actually written by Paul, which others were probably not.
We do that with Shakespeare too.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, and again, this is stuff that people with graduate degrees in literature, this is stuff we do all the time. And we can do it with scripture too. And don't even get me started on the Old Testament, because that took 1,000 years to write. The New Testament covers about 40, 50 years maybe. So multiply that times 20 and think about how much more complicated it is to figure out who wrote what, when, and where, and why.
Right. Mhm.
That's another whole long series. Okay. And it's fun. It's fun. So, all right, we got to quit. So thank you. And see you all next week. All right.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.